Welcome to Make It Plain, the podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, though, if you happen to ever listen to the live daily show, Make It Plain, and I hope you do, if you haven't yet, subscribe at makeitplain.com. I was talking about Black Friday and about, there was a headline in the New York Times about how it was the headline literally was that Black Friday is a money and time-sucking vortex.
That's right.
But then, at the same time, we were talking about this on Live Daily Show, the story comes out about corporations being in debt greater than ever before and financing that debt with junk bonds and selling shares. So the same corporations that want us to support them on Black Fridays are in debt, asking us with our consumer dollars to finance their debt, while they also benefit from a tax break Trump gave them that saw corporate taxes drop by $91 billion in 2018, while those of us who are individuals are paying more than $100 billion in taxes. All that's important. And when I had this conversation, I was talking with the Reverend Liz Theo Harris of the Poor People's Campaign, and just how the intersection of poverty and greed happens, but also when we talk about poverty, or even not poverty, we have to talk about hunger, which is also real, and all of those things go together. So we're happy to have with us a dear friend, an organization I love, and we always promise, we always talk during the holidays because of their annual event, but we always promise each other that we're going to talk more during the regular year as well, because they do work year-round. Hunger is not just a once-a-year thing. The organization I'm speaking of is WhyHunger, as in whyhunger.org. We're going to hear about WhyHunger and their Hungerthon. And we're happy to have, once again, dear friend. And no excuse now, because since we're in a new studio, the office is literally across the street. Senior Director of Programs. You could almost come co-host if you want to.
That's right.
Senior Director of Programs, Allison Cohen. How are you, Allison? Welcome back to Make It Plain.
Thank you, Mark. I am so thankful that you and Brittany reached out. You guys have a true commitment to WhyHunger, and we really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, since we relocated ourselves, all is now right with the world that you're here. The gang and the family is back together.
We're all back.
So we're grateful for that. So for this podcast audience, let's not assume they know all that we know about this great organization. But tell our audience about WhyHunger.
Sure. So WhyHunger, we've been around since 1975. We were founded by a radio DJ at the time, Bill Ayers, who is he co-founded the organization with Harry Chapin of, I always say, of Cats in the Cradle, and even among younger people that rings a bell, but Harry Chapin, who tragically died in the early 80s. And the two of them were talking on the radio, much like we are now, and made a commitment to each other to do something about the issue of hunger. And originally they were focused on hunger in Ethiopia and then in sub-Saharan Africa, and really focusing on hunger in other areas. And as they became more and more knowledgeable and digging into the issues of hunger, they realized that it was a scourge on our own society as well. And so since then, WhyHunger has been a global organization. We understand that hunger exists everywhere and that the root of hunger across the world is poverty. And it doesn't matter if you're living in the U.S. or you're living in India or in Zimbabwe, that ultimately the root is poverty. And in order for us, you were talking about the Poor People's Campaign and Reverend Liz, who's a good friend of ours, we share the same theory of change, which is that we need to build power if we're going to ultimately change the landscape such that we can end hunger. And WhyHunger, working both in the U.S. and around the world, believes that food should be recognized as nutritious food should be recognized as a human right. And that's our mission, and we believe that hunger is something that can be ended. And we have the privilege of working with many social movement leaders around the world and supporting them in their efforts to find and implement sustainable solutions in their own communities.
Also, at this time of year, though, we like to highlight Hungerthon, don't we?
Yes. So Hungerthon is a radio tradition that was started about the same time the organization was founded in 1975. And so for a period of about the week before Thanksgiving through mid-December, we do our best to take over the airwaves and raise awareness about issues of hunger, particularly focused in the U.S. For this time of year, and raise funds as well. And if you're interested in learning more about this particular campaign, you can go to hungerthon.org. There's we're seeking donations. We have lots of gifts that we can provide, auction items, a variety of different things. If that's your if that's what you're interested in. We also have a big storytelling site. So if you want to learn more about what we do and the folks that we're supporting, you can check that out too.
Folks, please and please be supportive of this issue. Go to hungerthon.org.
Yes,
correct. For your organization, are hunger and starvation synonymous?
No, they absolutely are not. And in fact, the UN came out with a new report recently. It used to be that more than 1 billion folks, like a few years ago, they said more than 1 billion folks are hungry. Now the report is 800 million are hungry, but we go way over 1 billion if we add those that are quote unquote food insecure, meaning that they may have to skip a meal every day. Maybe the parents or the adults in the family choose not to eat for a day or two so their children can eat. So they're making all kinds of concessions, and food is the first thing that goes because it's a variable, expense.
Right.
And so it's incredibly important to, in our opinion, to recognize that there is still malnutrition and starvation in some parts of the world, and that is a critical need that should be addressed immediately. And we have done very little to move the needle on the millions of people around the world, 37 million in this country, who face food insecurity on a daily basis.
Doesn't food insecurity include not just skipping meals, but living in communities with lack of access to nutritious food?
Yes, that's exactly right. And there is one of the things I think many of us don't realize in this country. When we think of hunger and poverty, we think of urban areas. In fact, poverty rates are much higher in rural areas than they are in urban areas, and part of that is because of the lack of access to grocery stores, lack of access to various places where you can purchase food, and some of that is as we know, small towns are drying up as farmers have had to get big or get out, and as corporations like Walmart have marched across this country and laid down their foundations. It has in fact resulted in areas that have minimum access to good, healthy food.
So just as I was talking to Reverend Liz, some people are impoverished and don't know it, and I believe that many people in the working class living paycheck to paycheck,
absolutely,
fall in that category. So by the same token, even in some urban areas, we live in this big city in New York, kids I know who eat at the carryout every night and don't miss a meal from the carryout.
Right.
But they may very well be, because absent grocery stores and access to other healthy food, they may very well fall in the category of being food insecure, right?
Absolutely, because they are not getting the proper nourishment.
Right.
From that kind of carry-out food. And there's a fair amount of So when we talk about, I know you hear this terminology, food desert, quite a bit, and we prefer to use the term. And food desert essentially means that there's poor access to food. That it's an area where it's difficult to find establishments where you can access good, healthy food. And we prefer to use the term food apartheid, which was coined by one of our board members and farmer extraordinaire Karen Washington here in the New York City area, and that is an important distinction for us because it really helps to first underscore that food deserts are not natural, right? So it's that there's a structural reason why that happens and why that exists, and that we could, if we had the right political will, could end we could end hunger. We could end the lack of access to fresh, nutritious food. Instead, what we're seeing is a real onslaught. A real what's the word that you use? A real sort of attack on the federal entitlement programs that are responsible for helping people just keep their heads above poverty and enable their families to eat. And that's become the sort of current climate that we're living in now.
And one of the programs that is putting a dent in food insecurity and everything else and hunger is SNAP.
SNAP, right, formerly called food stamps. And they changed the terminology to SNAP. Supplemental is the first word, as a way to underscore that it's not meant to feed an entire family, that it's meant to be a supplemental program so that that folks who are the poorest of the poor to those that are $400 away from a major catastrophe can at the very least have access to good, nutritious food. And it is also a program that to date has there are about 40 million folks in the U.S. every year that use SNAP. And currently, in the last year and a half, the USDA, as a part of the Trump administration, has proposed 3 rules. And I think this is also something that maybe we should do a little more education about, because I wasn't even really familiar how this whole rules process works, but essential changes are to some of the technical aspects of federal legislation, right? So in this case, the Trump administration has proposed 3 separate rules, and those have yet to go into effect. There's been an open comment period, which is the way in which it is that's the kind of checks and balances that exist. And ultimately, Congress, if these rules do go into effect, Congress could overturn them, could change them. And so it's critically important to understand what those rule changes are. And in our opinion, they're really insidious. And the Urban Institute just came out with a report literally a few days ago that talked about the impact that these 3 rules in combination could have on the American public. And they found that 3.7 million fewer people would receive SNAP in an average month. 2.2 million households would see their average monthly benefits drop to $127 from $183 or $184, which is not enough anyway to cover the cost of groceries for a family of 3. And that close to 1 million students are free or reduced lunches. In our opinion, this is an attack on a program that really is the closest thing we have to ensuring the right to food in this country. Yeah. And it continues to be whittled away in lots of different ways. This is sort of a backdoor way of really weakening this program, which has over the last decade enabled 30% of the food insecure population to have to lift themselves out of poverty.
Over the last decade, has that been an improvement on the decades prior to the last one?
We don't have data that goes. We have data that goes. They started tracking. The data for hunger was just about maybe 30, 40 years ago. And what we do know based on that data is that the percentage of our population in the U.S. that is considered food insecure or hungry has hovered around 11%, 11 or 12%. So it has yet to go back to pre-recession levels.
I see.
So meanwhile, we're hearing about how unemployment is going down, and those are not living wage jobs. Number one, there may be part-time jobs. There are jobs that don't come with benefits.
Right.
So there's a whole variety of issues that really prevent that make the increase in employment synonymous with a decrease in food insecurity. It's just not the case.
You also, the reason I asked that question is because you alluded to even the name SNAP, and that kind of went over my head.
Yeah.
Because I was like, why did they change the name in the first place? SNAP.
Right.
But like you said, maybe that was telegraphing part of the whittling. We just want this to be supplemental.
Yeah.
I I remember when a Democrat was in the White House, Clinton.
Yeah.
And, that whole Democratic Leadership Council argument of doing something about welfare, so to speak. And we protested that.
Yeah.
And like, no, that's not that's not the way to go. So that kind of helped usher in this era of shutting things down. Well, even before that, Reagan with the whole welfare queen mythology,
exactly,
which was not even a real person.
And that's a legacy, right? I mean, that we're constantly trying to change that narrative.
Yeah. But just speaking of the food insecurity, folks, I've had the honor over the years of doing some things in and around Hunger-a-thon, and going to, with you to some of the places where food is distributed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we have stereotypes and images. And when we think of hunger in a global sense, the first image that comes to mind is an East African child.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And not that that's wrong, but that's not the only image.
No.
When we think about hunger here in this country, the only image that conjures is literally a homeless person on the street.
Right.
But, it was an awakening to me. People were showing up to pick up food in days I was there.
Yeah.
Dressed like you and me.
Right.
And on the way to work.
Right.
And I remember you literally schooled me right on the spot. So, this is what, because I was like, okay, what is going on here?
Right.
And then you explained to me, no, this is what is going on.
Yeah, no, it's the reality for a minimum of 37 million people, and those are the ones that we're counting.
Right.
And we know that more than 50% of folks that rely on food banks and food pantries, which is the non-governmental sort of emergency food access system, which is it's no longer an emergency. It's become very commonplace for so many people. More than 50% of those participants are working, have at least one person in their household working full time.
Right.
And the whole idea of
and they might, some of them, since you mentioned
it,
some of them might actually be working for Walmart, right? Themselves.
Yes, in fact, and I wish I had this stat front and center in my mind, but there is a study that demonstrates that the grocery, these large grocery stores and chains reap an incredible amount of benefits through tax dollars from folks using SNAP and at their stores. And many of those folks are people that are employed that work for them.
Yeah. In
fact,
I don't know those numbers either, but those numbers out there, folks. We've all heard about them. How people at Walmart are still getting supplemental assistance, even though they're working at Walmart.
That's right. And the other interesting thing that I think it's kind of a little bit ironic, or just sort of an oxymoron, is that the largest percentage of workers that are food insecure work somewhere along the food chain. So they're serving our food, they're picking our food, they're processing our food, from one place to the next. The largest percentage of workers in this country that are food insecure are people who work in the food chain industry, all along the food chain, from food service to harvesting to, the whole thing. Wow. And there's an organization called the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which is a really close ally of ours, and they're out there organizing workers all across the food chain to change this narrative. Right.
Yeah.
And then you talked about like the image of the East African child, and meanwhile here in the U.S. we know that 1 in 7 children. So you go into a classroom, right, and you're a teacher in a classroom. 1 out of every 7 kids in your classroom is probably skipping meals, didn't have breakfast, relying on school lunch, not having enough food to eat over the weekend. That is a reality. Right. And so, and when you think about 37 million people, we encounter those folks every single day.
So just to recap that, because that's a very powerful statement. People who work in the food industry in every aspect are oftentimes the most food insecure.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's
and rely on SNAP more than any other sort of working sector, any other sort of sector.
But
the workforce.
as oxymoronic as it is, I mean that's the history of this country. My ancestors worked in that food industry, in that food chain.
Right.
Picking and doing agriculture, and yet were literally enslaved.
Right.
And malnourished because the good food we prepared in the house, we didn't get. We got the chitlins.
Right.
That's why we eat chitlins today.
Yeah.
And I know some folk are already going to turn this off because they don't think chitlins is a bad food. But, y'all, it's really not. It wasn't made. I don't think folk had that in mind when they were talking about fixing something to eat. Now, I've had them. I mean, I remember we used to eat them and they were good. I don't eat no more. But, when we figured out, we didn't know what they were.
Right.
But that's kind of the history of this country.
Yeah.
And that's that in of itself is shameful.
Yeah, and to me that it also calls to mind. I want to also paint a hopeful picture, which is that there are Black farmers in this country that are working to really take back the land, to take back the honor and the dignity of working the land, of owning the land, of or children, and I think that's an incredibly hopeful aspect of this power building, and it's something that WhyHunger's had the privilege of supporting as well. The National Black Food and Land. Wait, hold on, I got it wrong. NBFJA, National Black Food Justice Alliance, right. The Black Urban Growers. I mean, these organizations are doing really amazing work at a grassroots level to actually envision and implement the models that we want to see. They're putting in place the way that we would like. They're putting in place the future that they want to see for the rest of the country.
Well, and just before we leave that point, though, the 1 in 7.
Yeah.
When I lived in Washington, D.C., and it was snow, it was always a big thing. Wake up in the morning, school's going to be open and closed. And, despite his other shortcomings, Marion Barry was always reluctant to close schools.
Yeah.
And the reason he gave was because, and he said it publicly, he said a lot of these children won't get any. That happens here in New York. But I'm sure in many other jurisdictions, whether it's said publicly or not, when folks wonder, why isn't school closed? It changed my whole thought process of snow and school closing.
Right. Yeah, no, and I know it's something that we often talk about as well. In my world, in my sector, whether or not that is something that has been publicly stated here in New York, I'm not sure, but I know it is a reality. it's a reality that there for some kids they won't get lunch that day.
Yeah.
If school is closed, and so that's a real issue. And speaking of school meals, New York City has done an amazing job of guaranteeing we now have universal school meals.
Yes.
Which is one of the first in terms of a big city in this country to take that kind of step. And it took years of organizing and really pushing that. And that is something that we believe should be instituted across the country.
Yeah. Yeah.
Across the world, really.
Mm-hmm.
That if you show up to school, you get fed, and that is another way in which we could guarantee the right to food in this country.
We actually, not so shameless plug, here in our new studios, DNR Studios, we just had we do our fundraiser in October, our giving month, where we raise money to hire interns from the Farney Center, and we hire LGBT homeless youth as interns.
Yeah.
I don't even think Brittany knew about that. But when we hire these interns here at DNR Studios, separately, they also get a food stipend.
Yeah.
So that they can actually, these are homeless youth, so so one has nothing to do with the other. You get your stipend, but you also get a food stipend, so you can feed yourself.
Yeah, no, that's important. And the federal government doesn't include LGBTQ as in terms of food insecurity, but we know that LGBTQ youth in particular are among the most food insecure in this country as well.
Yeah.
So that's a remarkable contribution that you're making.
So we have Hungathon going on.
Yes.
What else are some of the other things that WhyHunger is doing throughout the year?
Yeah.
That, like immediately you would want people to get involved in? I hope people are hearing this and feeling inspired to get involved.
Yeah. So ultimately, we are aiming to build power among folks at the grassroots level that are already envisioning and enacting sustainable solutions to issues of hunger and poverty in their own communities. And our role is to really knit these organizations, these leaders, these groups together, both and globally, into a global social movement that will call for nutritious food as a human right. And so that's kind of the big broad picture of what we're working on. We work on a variety of different issues, really at the root causes of hunger and poverty, and we help to build networks and alliances. We're working with something called Closing the Hunger Gap here in the U.S., which is at this point approximately 600 different nonprofit organizations that are feeding people in their communities that have said, we just keep seeing more and more people coming every year, and so this rhetoric that we have that we're ending hunger is just not true. And what can we do differently? What is wrong with this system that food banks and food pantries have become and the charity model is what our country relies on. I mean, we've grown up with it, right? I mean, if you were a kid prior to 1960, maybe you remember a time when you would go to school and they wouldn't ask you for Thanksgiving to bring in extra cans of food, right? But for most of us, it's normative. That's what we've grown up with, and so another key area that WhyHunger is working on is really helping to change that narrative, that charity is important. It is never going to end hunger, and we need to really frame these issues in terms of justice. And if we can work at the root causes, if we can understand how powerlessness, poverty, race, climate, sexual orientation, how all these things intersect to perpetuate structural inequities, then we might be able to make a dent.
You said another powerful statement. Charity is never going to end hunger.
No. And it's important. I mean, I think while there are people in need, we need to be supporting them. At the same time that we're working towards and envisioning first, because you have to have the vision first, right? So envisioning a world where food banks are no longer necessary. And if we can envision that and we can begin to work towards it. And so one of our big efforts in the coming year, and we've been working on this for about 7 years, is creating a different kind of network and alliance of food banks and food pantries that say, yes, I want to get on that train. I want to imagine a world where 50 years, 10 years, 50 years, whatever it is, that we can shut our doors because we're no longer needed.
Not just canned goods. You're talking about changing systems.
Yeah,
that's why we're here.
Exactly.
Now, that's not that typical for a so-called charity organization.
Right.
A lot of folks just want to take that donation and be quiet. You rocking a few boats.
We are rocking a few boats, but you don't really.
That's what you do.
You don't get anywhere unless you do that, right?
You don't mind that, 'cause you like me. We rock boats, y'all.
It's like that feels more normative to me than anything else. But it's what we're doing. We feel like we're doing some truth telling, and we're supporting those. More importantly, supporting those who are on the front lines every single day to do that truth telling and to turn that into action.
Yeah. And frankly, suffering because of hunger is far more impolite than
right.
Rocking some boats.
Right.
Right. So
exactly.
we all think about the people that are going through that. And I hope you would, please, ma'am, please, sir, support Hungerthon. Go to hungerthon.org, but also WhyHunger, and get involved. I mean, you are, and I can say this as a minister, you are truly doing the Lord's work. That's literally, people go to church every Sunday and they read, I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was hungry and you fed me.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's just, but that's not alive. That's just in a book. It's a rote statement. We go on with our lives and get on Facebook.
Yeah.
And
we're not.
But Facebook,
we're not...
you can't eat Facebook.
No, you can't.
Facebook ain't going in fossil fuels. I mean,
That's
the fundamental things that are going to keep us alive are threatened.
Yes, that's right.
Every single day.
Yeah, I mean, our Mother Earth, the soil where the food is grown that feeds us.
Amen.
The air that we rely on, the water that we're poisoning, the oil spills that are leaking into the waterways. All of this is part and parcel of ending hunger in our view. And you can't eat money either.
Yeah.
And we need money to eat. So there you go. If that's the society we're living in, we've got to ensure that people have access to nutritious food in dignified ways.
So in part of the systems changing, it's about educating people. Some people don't even know what's nutritious and don't oftentimes know what they're eating or not eating is not nutritious.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot more information out there in the general public these days about, what's nutritious and what's not nutritious. And it's hard to know what to trust, right? Because one day it's like, oh, we shouldn't eat milk, or we shouldn't eat eggs. That was a big thing for a long time. And now it's like, well, no, eggs are actually good for you. So what we classify as nutritious food is food that is of the earth, that is grown and produced in ways that do not harm the earth, but rather help to rebuild soil, that contribute to a sense of climate justice, and that also contributes to the livelihoods of those who are growing, processing, picking, distributing the food as well.
Yeah.
So when you think about what is nutritious food, I think it's important to go beyond the nutrient content, because we find that when we go to looking at the entire system with a justice lens, that what you wind up with is highly nutritious food.
Yeah.
The two go together.
Yeah, the justice lens. I love that. Speaking of dignity and food security, I ran across our article. I was telling our producer, Brittany, about it yesterday. She remembered this conversation. Queen Elizabeth is 93. probably gonna let it be 100. And this whole article is about how she eats the same nutritious food every day, and it's healthy, but she's the queen. She can get that. That's brought to her.
Yeah.
My grandmother lived to be 98, and I kind of took for granted the things she did, but her diet is almost identical to the queen's. I mean, just the same basic thing.
Right.
And she grew up in a generation where there wasn't, all the junk food,
Right.
all of the fast food. I mean, some of that generation lived longer because they were closer to the land and had no choice but to eat that. There was no such thing as not preparing your own food.
Right, exactly.
And having access to good prepared food every night.
Right.
As opposed to just, I'm running around all day. Especially in this city. I mean, I do it all the time.
Right.
I'm just running all day, but let me just run and grab something to eat, kind of as a parenthetical to everything else I'm doing. Not that I need food to do all the other crazy stuff I'm doing, but it's just kind of a thing. So, I mean, the farther we've gotten from that type of culture, on top of the lack of access, on top of poverty,
Well, listen, Mark, we know that, again, that too is a system that is making a lot of money for a small number of people, and is being perpetuated. I mean, I think there's some intentionality around that, and not to be too, not to paint a too broad of a brushstroke, but industrial agriculture, big food and big agriculture is a problem. Yeah. It's a very serious problem. We know that industrial agriculture accounts for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than cars. That's more than, when we think about how are we going to reduce emissions, we need to fundamentally reform our agricultural system. And what we do here in the U.S. is being exported everywhere else. So this industrial agricultural system is very rapidly, in the last 20 years, been very rapidly encroaching upon the more regional and local agricultural systems that are still in place around the world.
Ending hunger with justice, y'all. That's what WhyHunger is all about. And that may be surprising because, again, most people, first thing you think about, you think about the charity and the giving of the money. But this is also about changing systems.
Right.
And we invite you to activists, along with WhyHunger.org and me. I'm a part of this, the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barber, Reverend Theo Harris. We're all a part of this. And it's long term. Everything will probably not change in our lifetime, but we do it for the grandchildren, and it just keeps going on from generation to generation. Hungerthon.org, WhyHunger.org. Allison, thank you.
Thank you.
And so,
thank you, Mark.
So glad to see you again. I am in your eternal service. So, use me.
Thank you. I will. I'll be calling you and Brittany.
Yeah, please do.
We got an issue. We need to get it out there.
Let's do it. Yeah, and I mean, not just that. I want to come to you.
Yeah. Please.
I want to be out in the streets with you again.
Yeah.
So let's get this done. And folks, during this holiday season, think about what others are going through, and don't take anything for granted. And again, it's not just what you do in the moment of a season, but what we do long term.
Right.
All right. And, even though the scripture says I was hungry and you fed me, that's not instantaneous. All right. That is, I was hungry. We all were hungry. And you fed us all over time and built a system where we would never be hungry again.
Right.
That's what that really means. Thus endeth the sermon. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you, Mark, so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.